In the year 382, the Roman Emperor Gratian did something that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. He ordered the removal of the altar of victory from the Roman Senate House, a sacred fixture that had stood there for over 400 years, since the time of Augustus. Senators had burned incense at that altar before every session. They'd sworn oaths on it. And now, with one imperial decree, it was gone. Here's the thing, though. When it happened, most of the Senate barely flinched. The old gods were abandoned, slowly and quietly, by a civilization that had simply moved on. The fall of Roman paganism was like a dimmer on a set of lights, turned down over the course of roughly 3 centuries. But even today, we are still left with the open question of why these gods, who had once served the Romans so well, were ultimately abandoned. Roman religion wasn't a faith in the modern sense. There was no sacred text, no central doctrine, no requirement to believe anything in particular. Roman religion was essentially transactional, in that you made offerings to the gods, and in return, you expected their favor. The formal term for this relationship was the Pax Deorum, or in English, the peace of the gods. The belief was that you keep the gods happy, and the state prospers, but if you neglect them, bad things happen. This worked brilliantly for centuries, mostly because Roman religion was flexible enough to absorb almost anything. Conquered a new territory with unusual gods that Roman society didn't have? Simply adopt them into the pantheon. Encounter a foreign cult that gains popularity with Roman citizens and soldiers? There was a similar solution. Find a Roman equivalent and say that it was really the same thing all along. The pantheon was less a rigid system and more a sprawling, open-source network of divine obligations. But that flexibility came with a cost. There wasn't much there to hold on to when something more compelling came along. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the cracks were already showing in fairly major ways. Rome's traditional religion had always been better at public ritual than private meaning. As the empire expanded and urbanized, people increasingly wanted something that spoke to them personally. Mystery cults, such as that of Mithras, had been filling that gap for generations, offering initiation rites, personal salvation, and a sense of belonging. Christianity, which had been growing steadily since the 1st century, offered all of that and then a little more as well. It had a coherent theology, a clear moral framework, a promise of life after death, and crucially, a community structure that functioned like a social safety net. Early Christian congregations took care of their sick, buried their dead, and fed their poor. They organized networks of charity that crossed ethnic and class boundaries in ways Roman civic institutions never had. In an empire where the state had declined to the point where it provided little of this for ordinary people, that mattered enormously. By the mid-3rd century, Christians may have represented somewhere between 2 and 3% of the empire's total population. That sounds tiny, but they were disproportionately concentrated in cities, well organized, and remarkably resilient. The persecutions under emperors like Decius and Diocletian, brutal as they were, failed to stamp the movement out. If anything, the martyrdoms only strengthened it. The blood of the martyrs, as the early Christian writer Tertullian reportedly put it, watered the seed of the church. Then came Constantine, and everything changed. In 312, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether he actually saw anything or simply made a calculated political decision is a question historians have debated for 17 centuries. What's not debatable is what happened next. He won the battle, credited the Christian God, and set the empire on an irreversible course. The Edict of Milan the following year didn't make Christianity the state religion. That's a common misconception, but its effect would have a major impact on Roman paganism. What it did was legalize Christianity and grant it equal status with other religions. But Constantine went further than mere tolerance, and he poured imperial funds into church construction and granted clergy tax exemptions. He also inserted himself into theological disputes like the Council of Nicaea in 325, where he attempted to shape Christianity in a way that made it beneficial to the state. The old pagan institutions didn't vanish overnight, but they were now competing with a rival that had the emperor's imperial treasury behind it. Temple revenues were gradually redirected, and pagan priesthoods slowly lost their public funding. Constantine's sons, particularly Constantius II, went further still, ordering the closure of some temples and banning sacrifices in certain regions. The economic and political infrastructure of traditional religion was being quietly dismantled, even while many of the temples themselves still stood open. There was one significant attempt to reverse the tide. In 361, Constantine's nephew Julian became emperor and immediately set about restoring paganism, earning him the nickname Julian the Apostate. He reopened temples, reinstated pagan priesthoods, and tried to build a pagan church structure modeled on the Christian one, complete with charitable institutions and a hierarchy of priests. He even wrote or had commissioned a philosophical treatise arguing against Christianity called Against the Galileans. Unfortunately, it only survives in small fragments because later Christian authors preserved just enough of it to refute. Julian's project was ambitious, intellectually serious, and ultimately doomed. He ruled for less than 2 years before dying on campaign against the Persians in 363. His pagan revival died with him, and no subsequent emperor would attempt anything similar. But the truth is that Julian's real problem wasn't a lack of time, it was a lack of believers. The educated pagan elite he was counting on had largely already hedged their bets or outright converted to Christianity. The grassroots enthusiasm simply wasn't there from the class of people who had the ability to institute such changes. After Julian, the trajectory was virtually entirely one-directional. Emperor Theodosius I delivered the decisive blows. In 380 AD, the Edict of Thessalonica declared Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. It wasn't just one of many legal religions anymore. It was the religion of the empire, but for a time, paganism would still be legal. That changed in the early 390s when Theodosius issued a series of decrees that effectively banned pagan worship altogether. Public sacrifices were outlawed and temples were closed and converted into churches. The eternal flame of the Vestal Virgins, which had been tended continuously for over 1,000 years, was extinguished, and the Vestals were disbanded. This was the period that saw the destruction of the Serapeum in Alexandria, one of the ancient world's most magnificent pagan temples, reportedly demolished by a mob in 391. The Serapeum had housed a satellite collection of the Great Library and served as a center of pagan intellectual life for centuries, and its destruction sent a clear message. Across the empire, statues of gods were toppled, defaced, or simply left to decay. The physical infrastructure of paganism was being systematically erased from the landscape. But here's where it gets interesting. Outlawing something and actually ending it are two very different things. Paganism didn't die when Theodosius said it should. It lingered, especially in the countryside. The Latin word paganus, from which we get pagan, originally meant something like country dweller or rustic, and there's a reason for that. Rural communities were the last holdouts, clinging to old festivals, sacred groves, and local shrines long after the cities had gone Christian. The Church spent centuries trying to stamp out these practices, often by simply absorbing them. They rebranded pagan festivals as Christian feast days, built churches on top of old sacred sites, and associated local deities with specific saints. In the Eastern Empire, the famous Academy of Athens, the philosophical school that traced its lineage back to Plato, continued to operate as a bastion of pagan thought. That was until Emperor Justinian shut it down in 529, a date that's sometimes cited as the symbolic end of classical paganism, though even that's debatable. Archaeological evidence from across the Mediterranean suggests that pagan practices persisted in isolated pockets well into the 6th and 7th centuries. In the Western Empire, the picture is even messier and muddier. The Franks, Goths, and other Germanic peoples who carved up the western provinces brought their own gods with them. From there, they created a complicated patchwork of Christian, Roman pagan, and Germanic pagan traditions that took centuries to fully sort out. So when did the Romans actually stop believing? The clear answer is that there was nothing approaching a single moment, as much as historians have tried to argue otherwise. It was a process that stretched from roughly the mid-3rd century to the late 6th century, over 300 years of gradual, uneven, and often messy transition. The emperors provided the political framework, and the bishops provided the institutional muscle. The ordinary people, on the other hand, made their own decisions based on community, conviction, and, let's be frank, which side had more to offer. To me, though, what's striking isn't that Rome abandoned its gods. It's how little resistance the old religion ultimately put up. Aside from Julian the Apostate, there was no serious pushback, and even that limited resistance was virtually completely wiped out by his successors. A system built on ritual obligation rather than personal faith turned out to be remarkably fragile when a more personal and more structurally resilient alternative came along. In the end, it seems that the traditional gods of Rome simply lost their audience. 10,000 Roman soldiers marched into the Arabian desert in 26 BC chasing frankincense and glory, and the desert swallowed them whole. Not in some dramatic last stand and not in a pitched battle against an overwhelming enemy. If the sources are to be believed, they lost just 7 men in combat across the entire campaign. The rest, thousands of men, died of thirst, disease, and a mysterious illness that paralyzed their mouths and then their legs, all while being deliberately led in circles. This is the story of how the ambition of Augustus Caesar collided head-on with the Arabian Peninsula, and how the peninsula won without really even trying. You may wonder why Rome sent an army into one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, a place known to the Romans as Arabia Felix. The name itself translates roughly to Fortunate Arabia or Happy Arabia, and it wasn't intended to be ironic. The southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, roughly modern-day Yemen, sat at the heart of one of the ancient world's most lucrative trade networks. Frankincense and myrrh, both tree resins harvested almost exclusively in southern Arabia, Ethiopia, and Somalia, were essential commodities in Roman religious and daily life. Romans burned frankincense at temples, at funerals, and in their homes, while myrrh, on the other hand, went into medicines, perfumes, and embalming preparations. By some estimates, southern Arabia was shipping over 3,000 tons of frankincense annually to Greece and Rome at the trade's peak. The problem, from Rome's perspective, was that every ounce of it passed through a series of middlemen. Arab merchants ran camel caravans along the incense route from modern Yemen to the Mediterranean, and each stop along the way added another markup. By the time a lump of frankincense reached a Roman market, its price had been inflated several times over. Augustus, fresh off consolidating his grip on Egypt following the deaths of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, looked south across the Red Sea and saw a golden opportunity. If Rome could control the source, or at least establish direct trading relationships, it could cut out the middlemen entirely. The man he chose for this job was Aelius Gallus, the second prefect of Roman Egypt. Gallus began his preparations in earnest, commissioning 130 transport vessels to be constructed at Cleopatris. This was near the old canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea in the vicinity of modern Suez. The force he assembled was substantial, around 10,000 infantry drawn from Roman legions stationed in Egypt and allied contingents. These allied troops included around 1,000 Nabatean soldiers, and they were key to the whole enterprise. Based in Petra, they controlled the northern stretches of the incense trade routes and, at least in theory, possessed invaluable knowledge of Arabian geography and tribal politics. The Nabatean king, Obotus III, provided a guide and minister named Sylleus, who was to lead the Roman army through the desert to the incense-producing regions. On the surface, Gallus had every reason to trust him. The Nabateans were ostensibly Roman allies, and Sylleus presented himself as cooperative and knowledgeable. But here's the thing. The Nabateans had absolutely no interest in Rome gaining direct access to the frankincense trade. Their entire economy depended on being the middlemen that Augustus wanted to eliminate, and Sylleus was less a guide and more a saboteur. The expedition launched from Cleopatris and immediately ran into trouble. The Red Sea, treacherous at the best of times for ancient vessels, battered the fleet badly. Storms wrecked several ships and others were driven onto reefs. By the time Gallus's diminished flotilla limped into a Nabatean trading port on the Arabian coast, 14 days had passed, and he'd already lost a significant portion of his transport capacity. The plan had originally called for a naval approach down the coast, but the ship losses made that impossible. Gallus had no choice but to commit to a land march through terrain he didn't understand, relying entirely on a guide who was actively working against him. The army spent the rest of the summer and the following winter at the port town of Luqaqam, a now lost location believed to be in what is now far northwestern Saudi Arabia. Gallus and company spent time regrouping and dealing with an outbreak of disease that Strabo, the Greek geographer, attributed to the local water and food. Strabo's account remains our most detailed primary source for the expedition, in large part because he and Gallus had traveled together in Egypt and were close friends. The geographer describes the illness as attacking the mouth first, causing a kind of paralysis, and then descending to the legs. Modern scholars have speculated this may have been scurvy or some nutritional deficiency disease, aggravated by unfamiliar water sources. However, others have speculated that the group may have been poisoned, perhaps by their so-called guide, though there's no direct evidence to confirm this. When the march finally resumed, Sylleus's treachery became the defining feature of the campaign. Rather than leading the army along established trade routes, he guided them through wastelands and took unnecessary detours. Strabo, writing in his geography, explicitly accuses Sylleus of acting as an undercover agent against the Romans. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian writing his account somewhat later, echoes this assessment. He noted that a journey that should have taken roughly 60 days was dragged out to 6 months. The army pressed through territory controlled by various hostile Arab tribes, then spent 50 grueling days crossing unmarked desert before reaching Najran. Najran is a city presently located in Saudi Arabia, near the border of modern Yemen, and notably, it's far inland. This is, of course, despite the fact that they could have simply hugged the coast for a much easier trip, again lending credibility to their guide working against them. From there, they fought their way through local resistance, reportedly defeating an army and slaying around 10,000 defenders in a pitched engagement near a river. They captured a town called Aska after its king fled, and then took another settlement, Athrula, without a fight. Gallus stationed a garrison there, arranged grain and water supplies, and pushed further south toward the jewel of Arabia Felix. That prize was a city that Strabo calls Marsyaba, widely identified by historians as Marib, the ancient capital of the Sabaean kingdom. The city was, by all accounts, the keystone of Arabia Felix. It sat at the nexus of the incense routes, and its great dam sustained agriculture in an otherwise arid landscape. If Gallus could take Marib, the expedition would have been a success by any measure. He reached its high walls, and that's where things fell apart for good. After 6 days besieging Marib, Gallus was forced to confront a brutal reality. His army was dying, and not from enemy arrows. Water was desperately scarce, and that mysterious disease continued to spread through the ranks once again. His supply lines, to the extent they even existed, were stretched impossibly thin across hundreds of miles of hostile desert, and couldn't sustain a prolonged siege. What happened next remains a historical mystery, though most sources seem to believe he launched a successful last-ditch assault on the city. However, the one source who differs, as I'll discuss in a moment, was Strabo, who actually knew Gallus, suggesting that this is where the Romans stopped. From there, the sources disagree on exactly how far south the Romans got and what exactly they did. Cassius Dio claims they reached a city called Athrula, though the location of this city, if it exists, is a complete mystery. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, argues Gallus pushed as far as a place called Carapeta, another location that may not actually exist. Once again, Strabo, who I need to stress, actually knew the man and was personal friends with him, insists they got no further than Marsyaba. It's unclear how such conflicting stories came to be, especially given that Strabo had a rare first-hand account of the leader of the expedition. Ultimately, whatever the case, Gallus made the only rational decision left to him, and he turned around. The retreat tells you everything you need to know about Silius's deception. The return journey to the northern coast of the Red Sea, where the journey began, took just 60 days as opposed to 6 months. The army that finally crossed the Red Sea back into Egypt was a shadow of the force that had departed. Disease, hunger, heat, and exhaustion had gutted it. The total combat dead for the entire expedition reportedly numbered just 7 men. Everything else was the desert and the betrayal. Strabo, for his part, laid the blame squarely on Silius and tried to shield his friend's reputation. The portrayal of Gallus as a competent commander undone by treachery has dominated the historical narrative ever since. And as you can likely tell, it's significantly influenced how I've approached and analyzed this historical journey as well. That said, it's worth noting that Strabo wasn't exactly a disinterested observer, given that he was a close personal friend of Gallus and had reason to make his friend look good. Further, his source on the matter was Gallus himself. So even if he tried to approach the situation somewhat objectively, he couldn't simply go and interview Silius for his account. Some modern scholars have questioned whether Gallus himself bore more responsibility for poor planning. Notably, Gallus had commissioned warships for the expedition which were woefully inadequate for the Red Sea. Even if the narrative that Silius was a saboteur is accurate, Gallus also seems to have placed significant trust into a man he ought to have known had competing interests. I suspect a more adept commander may have been able to root out this apparent treachery at some point, while being led around in circles. And speaking of Silius, I'm sure that you're all expecting that he met some sort of brutal end for his apparent betrayal of the Romans. And just to be clear, The Romans would ultimately put his head up on the chopping block, but I'll get to that in a moment. Remarkably, despite this disastrous expedition, he went on to thrive politically for a significant period of time, interacting with some of the most famous people in history. He rose in the Nabatean hierarchy and served as an ambassador to Judea, where he reportedly had a highly public affair with Herod the Great's sister Salome. The two even wished to get married, but Herod wouldn't allow it unless Silius abandoned his native religion and converted to Judaism. Silius wasn't willing to give up the religion of his ancestors, and so the marriage was never to be. After that, he continued operating as Nabatea's representative in Roman diplomatic circles, but his luck ran out eventually, as it tends to. He was executed in Rome around 6 BC, though the charges were apparently related to his broader political machinations rather than the Arabia expedition specifically. Emperor Augustus, characteristically for a man who was the adoptive son of Julius Caesar, spun the disaster as a success. In his Res Gestae, the great autobiographical inscription cataloging his achievements, he mentions the Arabian campaign in terms that suggest territorial gains. He wasn't entirely lying, and the army had won its battles and governed territory in the region very briefly. But the strategic objective, direct Roman control over the incense trade routes, was a complete failure. The expedition to Arabia Felix stands as one of the most striking examples of Rome reaching the limits of what its military machine could accomplish. The legions could meet and defeat any conventional army put in front of them, and they proved it repeatedly in Arabia. But they couldn't defeat geography, poor logistics, and the calculated treachery of an ally who understood that some trade routes are worth more than any treaty. Rome, in essence, lost due to attrition rather than anything else, leading historians to question why such a poorly planned expedition was even launched in the first place. We've spent roughly 2,500 years assuming the ancient Greeks were true believers in their own mythology, that they heard the stories of Zeus hurling thunderbolts and Poseidon shaking the earth and nodded along, and while this is a comfortable picture, it's almost entirely wrong. The reality is that Greek intellectuals were picking apart their own religious narratives for centuries. This is the story of how the relationship between the average Greek citizen and the gods was far stranger and more complicated than most people realize. The earliest recorded pushback against Greek myth didn't come from an outsider to the tradition, looking to undermine a core element of ancient Greek culture. In fact, it came from within the culture itself, and it came much earlier than you would expect. In the 6th century BC, a poet and thinker named Xenophanes of Colophon launched what might be the first sustained intellectual critique of anthropomorphic religion in Western history. His argument was devastatingly simple. Humans invent gods that look like themselves. He pointed out that the Thracians imagined their gods with red hair and blue eyes, while the Ethiopians depicted theirs with dark skin. He went further, suggesting that if horses and cattle had hands and could paint, they'd draw gods that looked like horses and cattle. And this thinker wasn't some fringe crank shouting into the void. He was widely read, widely discussed, and his ideas rippled outward through Greek intellectual life for centuries. Around the same period, early Greek natural philosophers were already proposing non-divine explanations for phenomena that myth had traditionally attributed to the gods. Thales of Miletus argued that earthquakes weren't caused by Poseidon's trident, but by the earth floating on water. Anaximander proposed that life originated from moisture acted upon by the sun, not from the creative whims of Prometheus and some hunks of clay. These thinkers weren't atheists in the modern sense, but they were systematically removing the gods from their explanatory role in the natural world. This is arguably more radical than simply denying they exist, since it suggests that even if they do, the Greeks may not have it right. If anyone illustrates the complexity of Greek attitudes toward myth, it's Plato. On one hand, he was arguably the most influential religious thinker in the Greek tradition. On the other, he wanted to ban Homer and Hesiod from his ideal city. His objection wasn't that the myths were false in some literal sense. His problem was that they depicted the gods behaving badly, engaging in deception, jealousy, adultery, and violence. He believed these stories corrupted the moral character of citizens who heard them. In his Republic, he proposed a radical program of censorship. Only myths that portrayed the gods as perfectly good and perfectly rational would be permitted. What's fascinating here is that Plato didn't reject myth as a form. He actually invented his own myths, elaborate allegorical stories designed to communicate philosophical truths he felt couldn't be expressed through pure argument alone. He understood that narrative had a power that logic alone didn't, and he wanted to harness that power while stripping away what he saw as the moral corruption of the traditional stories. He wanted a deliberate project of myth reform that took storytelling seriously, precisely because it understood how deeply those stories shaped a culture's moral imagination. If Zeus behaved like a monster, it was, in essence, a license for average Greeks to behave in much the same way. This idea was, in essence, that the stories of the gods had been corrupted by humans who wanted to act poorly or justify their tyrannical rule. The tension between myth and evidence found its sharpest expression in the work of Greek historians. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, treated myth with a kind of respectful agnosticism. He'd report what various peoples believed, sometimes noting that he personally found certain stories implausible, but he rarely dismissed them outright. He was essentially saying that he'd pass the story along, but the listener could make up their own mind about whether it actually happened. Thucydides took things considerably further. Writing just a generation after Herodotus, he essentially declared that anything that couldn't be verified through testimony or evidence wasn't worth including in serious historical writing. He explicitly distanced his work from what he called the mythical, arguing that his account of the Peloponnesian War would be less entertaining than the stories told by writers before him. But he believed it would be far more useful to anyone who wanted to understand human nature and political reality, and ultimately, in the end, we know he was right in this assessment. This was, effectively, a 5th century BC historian telling his audience that the age of taking myths at face value was over. That is, at least for anyone interested in understanding how the world actually worked, rather than those who simply wanted a good narrative to listen to. But here's the thing. Elite intellectual skepticism is one thing. What about the average person in Athens or Corinth or Thebes? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the evidence suggests that even ordinary Greeks didn't relate to their myths the way we might assume. Ritual practice, not doctrinal belief, was the foundation of Greek religion. There was no sacred scripture. You weren't expected to believe specific theological propositions. You were expected to participate in festivals, pour libations, make sacrifices, and honor the gods through action. Whether you personally believed that Athena had literally sprung fully armed from Zeus's skull was, in a functional sense, beside the point. This created a religious culture that was remarkably tolerant of variation in personal belief. A farmer in a rural area, with effectively no access to education, might have taken the myths quite literally. A merchant in Athens who'd attended a few philosophical lectures might have understood them as allegories that existed to explain, rather than literal accounts. A priestess at Delphi might have believed that she literally could interact with divine forces directly, and may have had extreme faith in the reality of the gods. Yet none of them would have been branded a heretic for their particular interpretation, because the concept of heresy as a religious offense essentially didn't exist in Greek religion. What mattered was orthopraxy, right practice, not orthodoxy, right belief, and there was, in essence, no orthodoxy anyway. By the Hellenistic period, roughly the 3rd century BC, skepticism toward myth had become something close to an intellectual industry. A writer named Euhemerus published a work in which he argued that the gods had originally been human kings and heroes whose deeds were gradually exaggerated. Over the generations, he proposed, the original human seed was lost, and they were worshipped as purely divine beings. Zeus, in his telling, was most likely actually a mortal ruler of Crete who'd been deified after his passing. This approach, which later scholars would term Euhemerism, became enormously influential and essentially provided a framework for treating mythology as distorted history. The Stoic philosophers took yet another approach, reading the myths as allegories for natural processes. Zeus represented the sky, Hera the air, Hephaestus fire, and other gods represented other elements or natural forces. The Epicureans, meanwhile, argued that the gods existed, but were completely indifferent to human affairs. This effectively rendered the entire mythological tradition, with its stories of divine intervention and punishment, irrelevant to daily life. By the time Rome absorbed Greek culture, the intellectual toolkit for dismantling myth was remarkably well developed. Greek thinkers had, across several centuries, developed virtually every strategy for rationalizing, allegorizing, historicizing, or simply dismissing traditional mythology. For their part, the Romans, being much more conventionally religious, generally viewed these outlooks on the gods with extreme suspicion. The question of whether the Greeks believed their own myths turns out to be the wrong question entirely. The more accurate question is, which Greeks, during which period, and what do we even mean by belief? The ancient Greek world contained committed skeptics, casual agnostics, devout practitioners, philosophical allegorists, and everything in between. Their relationship with myth was less like a modern person's relationship with religious doctrine and more like our own complicated relationship with national founding stories. We retell them, we celebrate them, we build institutions around them, and we simultaneously understand that the literal details are, at best, heavily embroidered. The Greeks didn't just invent philosophy, after all. They also invented religious doubt, and they did it with a rigor that still holds up remarkably well today. Zhuangzi gave the world one of philosophy's most haunting images. A man who dreamt he was a butterfly, and when he wakes up, he wonders if his entire life he had simply been a butterfly dreaming he was a man. But the deeper irony is this: the philosopher behind that dream may himself be little more than a literary device dreamed up by later scholars. We have no contemporary witness to his life, no solid trail of evidence, just a book, a few fragile anecdotes, and a biography so thin it barely counts. Like so many things in Chinese history, the earliest account we have comes from the records of the Grand Historian, composed around 94 BC by the Han Dynasty court historian Sima Qian. This is the single most important historical text in the Chinese tradition, covering roughly 2,500 years of history. It's the closest thing we have to an authoritative source on Zhuangzi's life. But here's the thing: the biography is shockingly brief. Sima Qian tells us that Zhuangzi was a minor official from the town of Meng in the state of Song, and that he lived during the late 4th century BC. His name, according to the great historian, was Zhuang Zhou, with his more familiar name simply meaning Master Zhuang. It's noted in the biography that his philosophical thought was drawn primarily from the teachings of Lao Tzu, a fact that will be important later. As I'll discuss, a later scholar significantly edited Zhuangzi's work, and this passage confirms at the very least that it was always a fundamentally Taoist text. Sima Qian also references a text of roughly 100,000 characters attributed to Zhuangzi, and that's essentially the whole biography. The problem of evidence gets more severe when you realize that his source for almost everything used by Sima Qian is the Zhuangzi, the self-titled book attributed to the master himself. In other words, the biography is largely just a summary of the book, with no independent sources used. If the biographical evidence is thin, the textual evidence is genuinely complex. The Zhuangzi, as we know it today, is a 33-chapter work divided into 3 sections. The inner chapters, which comprise the first 7, the outer chapters spanning 8 through 22, and the miscellaneous chapters from 23 through 33. But this arrangement isn't original. It's the product of an editorial intervention that took place roughly 600 years after the text was supposedly written. Around 300 AD, a scholar named Guo Xiang took a version of the Zhuangzi that reportedly contained 52 chapters and cut it down to 33. He removed material he considered questionable and imposed his own philosophical preferences on what remained. Guo Xiang's edition is the only complete version that survives today, and everything that came before his editorial scissors is lost, except in brief reference. So when we read the Zhuangzi, we're reading a text that was already philosophically filtered by a man who lived more than half a millennium after the supposed author. The traditional view holds that the inner chapters, those first 7, represent the authentic voice of Master Zhuang himself. The outer and miscellaneous chapters were composed by later followers and editors. Modern scholarship has broadly upheld this division, but with significant complications. Careful linguistic and philosophical analysis of the text has identified at least 5 distinct authorial voices across the 33 chapters. The historical Zhuangzi, if he existed, accounts for only one of those voices. Some scholars have taken a strongly skeptical position, arguing that there's no reliable historical data for Zhuangzi at all. Others maintain that the philosophical coherence and distinctive literary voice of the inner chapters point strongly toward a single, historically real author. The mainstream position tends to fall somewhere in the middle. Most scholars accept that a historical figure named Zhuangzhou probably existed in the state of Song during the 4th century BC. They also accept that he was likely responsible for at least some of the material in the inner chapters. Personally, I think the most interesting thing here isn't really whether Zhuangzi was one person or many. It's the irony. The Zhuangzi is a text that's obsessed with the instability of identity, with the idea that the boundaries between self and other are far less solid than we'd like to believe. I opened with that famous passage where Zhuangzi dreams he's a butterfly, and then wakes up unsure whether he's a man who dreamed of being a butterfly or a butterfly now dreaming it's a man. For a philosopher whose central insight was that identity is fluid and categories are illusions, the fact that his own identity has dissolved into historical uncertainty feels almost poetic. The man who told us the self is an illusion became one, and maybe, in a way only Zhuangzi would appreciate, that's the whole point. Here's a question that should bother you more than it probably does. The single most influential military mind in human history might never have existed. His name sits on the desks of CEOs and 4-star generals, gets quoted in boardrooms and barracks and self-help podcasts, and yet there's a very real possibility that Sun Tzu was nobody. Not a man or a general, instead just a title, slapped onto a collection of ideas assembled by committee over the course of a century or more. The Art of War is arguably the most widely read strategic text ever written, and the identity of its author remains one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in intellectual history. Sun Tzu isn't a personal name. It's an honorific, roughly translated as Master Sun. His supposed given name was Sun Wu, and traditional accounts place his birth around 544 BC in the state of Qi, during what historians call the Spring and Autumn period. This was a time of extraordinary political fragmentation when the old Zhou dynasty was collapsing and over 100 rival states were fighting for dominance. It was also a golden age of philosophy, and Confucius was developing his ethical framework while Lao Tzu was laying the foundations of Taoism. Sun Tzu, according to tradition, emerged from this era as a thinker who turned his mind not toward morality or metaphysics, but toward the ruthless calculus of war. The earliest biographical account comes from the records of the Grand Historian, composed around 94 BC by the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian. According to this account, Sun Wu, who had already written extensively, traveled to the state of Wu, where he was introduced to King He Lu. What follows is one of the most famous anecdotes in Chinese historical writing. He Lu, intrigued by Sun Wu's treatise, challenged him to demonstrate his principles by training 180 palace concubines into soldiers. Sun Wu divided them into two groups, appointed the king's two favorites as commanders, and issued orders. When the women laughed and ignored him, he had the two favorites executed over the king's protests, and the remaining women obeyed without hesitation. He Lu, shaken but impressed, appointed Sun Wu as a general in his army, and as they say, the rest is history. According to this traditional account, this grand general would then go on to lead his troops to major victories in well-known and documented historical battles. It's a compelling story, and it's also, almost certainly, more parable than history. Skepticism about Sun Tzu's existence didn't begin with modern Western scholars. It started in China itself during the Song dynasty. In the 12th century, the scholar Ye Shi noticed something troubling for such a great figure. The most detailed contemporary chronicle of the Spring and Autumn period never mentions Sun Tzu at all. To make matters worse, this text covers the Battle of Boju in 506 BC, the very battle Sima Qian credits Sun Tzu with winning. But this isn't just a brief mention. The battle is covered in considerable detail, yet the supposed mastermind behind the victory doesn't appear anywhere in its pages. For a military genius who allegedly transformed the state of Wu into a major regional power, this silence is deafening. The problems don't end there. The name Sun Wu doesn't appear in any surviving text written before Sima Qian's records. Some scholars have suggested the name itself might be a literary invention, a descriptive label rather than an actual identity. According to Chinese scholars, the surname Sun can be read as a cognate of a word meaning fugitive, while Wu carries the meaning of valiant or warrior. Put together, the name reads less like a birth certificate and more like a character description, the valiant fugitive warrior. Given his martial prowess and the fact that he left his homeland to serve another king, seems to suggest that Sun Wu, presented as his actual name, may have been a later invention. However, this presents another problem, since someone of a different name and of equal strategic prowess should likely be mentioned in the historical accounts of the Battle of Boju. Then there's the text itself. The Art of War contains anachronisms that don't fit a 6th century BC origin. It references crossbow technology that wasn't widely available until the Warring States period, roughly a century later. It also describes large-scale conscript armies and professional generalship, features of warfare that didn't exist during the Spring and Autumn period. During this period, battles were smaller affairs, dominated by hereditary aristocratic commanders, who commanded regardless of merit. The philosophical vocabulary also aligns more closely with Warring States era thought. The text suggests the author was familiar with major schools of philosophy that were in a nascent form at the time The Art of War was traditionally believed to be authored. Yet despite this, the author shows a great degree of familiarity with these concepts, which is highly improbable or perhaps impossible based on competing timelines. Taken together, these inconsistencies have led a significant number of historians to conclude that The Art of War wasn't written in the late 6th century BC. This has given rise to what scholars call the accretionist theory, the idea that The Art of War wasn't the work of one author, but rather a body of strategic thought that accumulated over time. Under this model, a kernel of military wisdom may have originated with a real figure associated with the state of Wu. However, the text was expanded, revised, and refined by generations of strategists across the Warring States period. By the time it reached its final form, it represented the collected thinking of an entire tradition rather than the insights of a single mind. Some proponents suggest the text was eventually attributed to a legendary Master Sun, in accordance with the Chinese convention of crediting a school of thought to a founding sage. This isn't as unusual as it might sound. The same authorship questions surround other towering figures of ancient Chinese philosophy. Lao Tzu, the supposed founder of Taoism, may not have been a historical individual either. Confucius himself, though likely more firmly historical, also didn't write directly, and his Analects are a collection of his sayings and anecdotes, which were recorded by his students. Some of this unwritten Confucian wisdom may have been expanded upon and then attributed to Confucius by these disciples. And in the Western tradition, we've been arguing about Homer since the Golden Age of Athens. The ancient world's relationship with authorship was fundamentally different from our own. The debate took a dramatic turn in April 1972 when construction workers in Shandong province accidentally unearthed a pair of Han Dynasty tombs at the Silver Sparrow Mountain. Inside tomb number 1, archaeologists discovered 5,000 bamboo strips covered in densely written characters. The strips had been preserved for over 2,000 years by groundwater saturation and airtight conditions. Among the texts recovered were 13 fragmentary chapters of Sun Tzu's Art of War, but there was also something else. There were 16 chapters of an entirely separate text known as the Art of War by Sun Bin. This was a revelation. Sun Bin was a figure who had long been conflated with Sun Tzu in Chinese historical writing. Classical texts referred to both men simply as Master Sun, and because Sun Bin's treatise had been lost in antiquity, significant confusion arose among scholars. Most historians had come to believe that Sun Tzu and Sun Bin were the same person. The discovery proved they weren't, and Sun Bin, who lived in the 4th century, had produced a completely distinct work, though one with some notable overlaps with the earlier text. The find demonstrated that by the 2nd century BC at the latest, the Chinese literary tradition recognized 2 separate master-son figures with 2 separate military treatises. Ultimately, modern scholarship recognizes 3 viable possibilities about the historicity of one of the greatest thinkers in military history. The first is the traditional view. Sun Tzu existed as a historical figure in the late 6th century BC, served the king of Wu, and authored the core of the Art of War. The second is a modified historicist position. A real military figure existed, but later in time than tradition suggests, and his original work was substantially expanded by later hands. The third is the full skeptic's position. Sun Tzu never existed as a discrete individual, and the Art of War is the accumulated product of an entire military intellectual tradition. Under this view, it was assembled either by committee or over time, and attributed after the fact to a legendary figure. But the honest answer is that we simply don't know, and we may never know, because something happened that may make this answer unknowable. The destruction of texts ordered by the Qin Emperor in 213 BC obliterated vast quantities of pre-imperial Chinese writing. To create a new imperial state, he wanted to eliminate many remnants of the past which were incongruent with his idea of what the Chinese Empire would be. And yet, here's the thing that makes this question fascinating rather than merely academic. It doesn't diminish the text one bit. Whether the art of war was the product of a single brilliant strategist or the distilled wisdom of generations, its influence is beyond dispute. It shaped celebrated campaigns during the Three Kingdoms period in the 3rd century, informed Napoleon's approach to maneuver warfare, and was required reading for officers in Imperial Japan. Figures as varied as Chairman Mao, Douglas MacArthur, and Ho Chi Minh all sought inspiration from the text. Today, it's assigned in business schools and quoted in political strategy, and the ideas endure because they work, regardless of who first articulated them. Sun Tzu, whoever or whatever he was, understood something most people still struggle to grasp. The best victories are the ones achieved before the fighting starts. That insight didn't require a single author, nor did it require a real name. It just required someone, at some point in the violent churn of ancient China, to write it down on a strip of bamboo and trust that it would survive, and against all odds, it did. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the share button and send this video to your friends and family who enjoy historical content. Also, don't forget, you can also find more of my historical content on my Spotify video podcast as well, at Lazy Chill History. In the summer of 323 BC, Alexander the Great lay dying in Babylon. He was 32 years old and had conquered more of the known world than any single individual before him. His empire stretched from Greece to the borders of India, encompassing Egypt, Persia, and vast stretches of Central Asia. But there's an ancient history mystery that's fascinated scholars since antiquity, one that sits at the intersection of what Alexander knew and what he didn't. As he gazed westward from his deathbed, did he have any meaningful awareness of the small but growing Roman Republic on the Italian peninsula? While the short answer is almost certainly yes, there's more to the story than that. The longer and far more interesting answer involves trade networks, diplomatic envoys, Greek colonies, and the ambitions of a man who reportedly wept because he had no conquests left. It's tempting to imagine the ancient world as a patchwork of isolated civilizations, each ignorant of the other, but that picture is simply wrong. By the 4th century BC, the Mediterranean was a deeply interconnected body of water. Greek colonies dotted the coastlines of southern Italy and Sicily, a region the Greeks themselves called Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. Cities like Syracuse, Tarentum, and Neapolis weren't backwaters, but rather thriving centers of Greek cultural life. Syracuse alone rivaled Athens in wealth and prestige during certain periods of the classical era. These Greek colonies had been in direct and sustained contact with the Italian peoples, including the Romans, for generations. Trade goods, mercenaries, political refugees, and intelligence flowed freely between the eastern and western Mediterranean. Greek potters sold their wares in Roman markets, and Roman elites were already beginning to absorb elements of Greek culture. The idea that Alexander, who was educated by Aristotle and maintained a sophisticated network of correspondence across the known world, would have been ignorant of Rome doesn't add up. The Greeks of Magna Graecia would have known about Rome, and what the Greeks of the West knew, the Greeks of the East could easily learn. Several ancient writers explicitly claim that Alexander had contact with Rome, though these accounts need to be handled carefully. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder recorded that a Roman embassy was sent to Alexander, though the details are sparse. Many scholars question whether this event actually occurred or was a later Roman invention designed to elevate their city's importance in retrospect. After all, the lack of direct attention paid to Rome by Alexander was, paradoxically, something of a sore spot for the Romans. Another writer, writing in the 2nd century AD, but drawing on much earlier sources, mentioned that various embassies from Italy came to Alexander in Babylon. Some versions of this account include the Romans among those delegations, though again this has to be handled with caution. The Greek historian Strabo noted the broader awareness Greeks had of Italy and its peoples. Cleitarchus, one of the earliest historians of Alexander's campaigns, apparently referenced Western peoples seeking audiences with the conqueror. Unfortunately, though, his original work survives only in fragments cited by later authors, so it remains unclear who these people were. While some have speculated these could have included Romans, others believe that this could be a reference to the Carthaginians or other Western Mediterranean groups. The Roman historian Livy, writing during the reign of Augustus, famously digressed into an alternative history scenario. And I need to take a moment here to shout out one of the first known instances of written alternative history in human history. In Book 9 of Ab Urbe Condita, he posed a striking question. What if Alexander the Great hadn't died young and had instead marched his armies west into Italy? If you're familiar with Livy and his relationship with Augustus and his promotion of the power of traditional Roman virtues versus Greek ideas, you'll be able to guess what comes next. Livy treats the scenario seriously, weighing Alexander's reputation as one of history's greatest commanders against the rising power of Rome. He acknowledges Alexander's tactical brilliance and the fear his name inspired across the known world, but ultimately argues that Rome would have prevailed. In Livy's view, Rome's strength did not rest on a single man, but on its institutions, its deep reserves of manpower, and its network of loyal allies. Even a conqueror like Alexander, he suggests, would have struggled against a system designed to endure setbacks and recover. Of course, knowing that Alexander was a man who maintained an undefeated record taking on the massive Persian Empire, this strains credulity in the extreme. However, his point was to prove that with traditional Roman know-how and a good deal of traditional Roman gumption, the Romans could have somehow managed a hard-fought victory. I question whether Livy himself even believed that this was the case, but of course, as I mentioned, the man had an agenda, and facts weren't going to get in the way of his conclusion. Livy's entire digression only makes sense if his audience already accepted the premise that Alexander at least knew Rome existed. But of course, the difficulty is separating genuine 4th century BC intelligence from later literary invention. Roman writers had a strong incentive to connect their city to Alexander, since it made Rome seem important on the world stage from an earlier date. It also flattered Roman vanity by placing their ancestors in the same narrative as the greatest conqueror who ever lived. Livy's conclusion, too, again, serves more as a flattery of Rome rather than an accurate depiction of the relative strengths of the Romans versus Alexander's army. Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. Alexander's maternal uncle, Alexander of Epirus, actually led a military campaign into southern Italy in 334 BC. This was the very same year Alexander the Great crossed into Asia. Alexander of Epirus had been invited by the Greek city of Tarentum to help defend against the Lucanians and Bruttians, Italic peoples who were pressing hard against the Greek colonies. He fought several battles, won some early victories, and was eventually cut down at the Battle of Pandosia around 331 BC. This was a major military expedition by a king who was closely related to Alexander the Great by blood and by marriage. Alexander of Epirus had married Cleopatra of Macedon, Alexander the Great's full sister. The wedding itself was the very occasion at which Philip II of Macedon was assassinated. The idea that Alexander the Great wouldn't have known about his own uncle's military adventures in Italy strains credulity beyond the breaking point. Ancient sources record that Alexander of Epirus made a somewhat bitter comparison, reportedly saying that while his nephew fought effeminate soldiers in Asia, he himself fought men in Italy. Whether or not this quote is genuine, it reflects a tradition that both campaigns were understood as parallel enterprises by contemporaries. And as an aside, the quote was filtered through Roman sources, and the Romans loved to portray themselves as rugged, manly men, so there's reason to believe the exact quote was altered. If Alexander the Great received reports from his uncle's Italian war, and it would be extraordinary if he didn't, then he'd have received intelligence about the political landscape. Alexander would have had to have at least some knowledge of central and southern Italy, including the growing influence of Rome. So if Alexander was aware of Rome, what would he have actually known? In the 330s and 320s BC, Rome wasn't yet the superpower it would become. It hadn't even completed the conquest of the core regions of the Italian peninsula. The Romans were still fighting the Samnite Wars, a grueling series of conflicts against the tough mountain peoples of central Italy that would drag on for decades. Rome was still a generation or more away from dominating all of Italy, let alone projecting power across the wider Mediterranean. Its population was substantial but not enormous, and its navy was essentially non-existent, at least compared to the Greek city-states in Italy, as well as the Carthaginians. To Alexander, Rome would have looked like one of many regional powers in the Western Mediterranean. He may have thought it notable, perhaps, for its military tenacity and its unusual republican form of government, but not yet a rival to the great empires of the East. He would have understood it primarily through the lens of Greek colonial reports. The Greeks of southern Italy would have described Rome as a significant and expanding Latin city-state with a capable army. It was one that was increasingly asserting dominance over its neighbors, but that hadn't yet entered the big leagues of Mediterranean politics. Alexander's court would have also understood Rome's geography quite thoroughly. Greek navigators and traders had mapped the Italian coastline thoroughly, and Greek colonies maintained regular shipping routes to and from the eastern Mediterranean. Aristotle himself, Alexander's former tutor, collected constitutions from across the Greek world and was interested in comparative political systems. It's entirely plausible that Alexander had access to at least a basic understanding of Roman political organization through the intellectual networks his teacher had established. That said, he would have almost certainly known that Rome didn't have a king, and in fact, had a well-known hatred of monarchy. Their republican form of government would have perhaps been the fact that made Rome stand out as interesting to Aristotle, and from there, that would have been transmitted to Alexander. There's another tantalizing thread. Multiple ancient sources claim that Alexander was planning a massive westward campaign at the time of his death. Diodorus Siculus described plans that included the conquest of Carthage, a circumnavigation of either Arabia or Africa, and operations in the western Mediterranean. If these plans were genuine, and historians are split on this, they suggest Alexander viewed the West as a future theater of operations. Alexander likely wouldn't have planned a campaign into the western Mediterranean without having significant intelligence about who controls what territory there. After all, one of the ways Alexander was able to function as such a brilliant strategic commander, as well as a tactical field commander, was through gathering intelligence. Whether Alexander specifically planned to confront Rome is ultimately unknowable, barring the discovery of new primary sources. That said, it's possible that Rome would have played only a minor role in these plans, since, as I mentioned, There was a much greater power in the region. Carthage, not Rome, would have been the more obvious Western target given its wealth, naval power, and control of key trade routes across the Western Mediterranean. But any serious campaign in the Western Mediterranean would eventually have brought Alexander into contact with Roman territory or Roman interests. The Romans controlled a growing stretch of central Italy by this point, and any force operating in the region would have had to account for them. The question of whether Alexander knew about Rome matters because it speaks to a larger truth about the ancient world. Alexander's empire was built on intelligence as much as brute force, and his court in Babylon attracted embassies and visitors from across the known world. He surrounded himself with men who made it their business to understand the political geography of every region within reach. Alexander the Great almost certainly knew about Rome. He would have known it as a rising but still regional power in central Italy. He couldn't have known, that this same city would eventually eclipse his own empire and come to dominate the entire Mediterranean world. And that's the great irony. The man who conquered what was then the meaningful known world probably gave Rome almost no thought whatsoever, much to the shame of the Romans themselves. Somewhere around 520 BC, a man whose name most people have never heard set out on one of the most extraordinary voyages in the ancient world. His name was Scylax, and he came from a tiny place called Carianda, a small island settlement off the coast of Caria in what's now southwestern Turkey. He wasn't Greek in the way we'd typically imagine. He was almost certainly an ethnic Carian, a member of an ancient people who spoke a language scholars still haven't fully deciphered. However, he knew Greek well and used it for his writing, as was the style in that place and time. His hometown sat just 10 miles north of Halicarnassus, which would later produce Herodotus, and roughly 20 miles south of Miletus, the intellectual powerhouse of the Ionian world. At the time, Caria was under the control of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This was the empire of Darius I, one of history's great empire builders, a ruler whose ambitions stretched from the Aegean Sea to Central Asia. Darius wanted to understand his empire, to map it, to plan his next moves, and fully extract all the wealth he could from it, and that's where Scylax entered the picture. He was, by Herodotus's account, a sea captain, a man Darius trusted to tell him the truth about what lay beyond the empire's eastern frontier. The fact that a Carian was trusted with this mission tells us something important about the Achaemenid world. This was a multi-ethnic empire that drew talent from every corner of its vast domain, and Scylax was proof that competence mattered far more than origin. Darius had a specific obsession. He wanted to know where the Indus River emptied into the sea. Herodotus, writing in his histories, tells us that Darius was eager to learn more about this great river, which he noted was one of only 2 rivers in the world known to produce crocodiles. Darius was planning a conquest, and he needed intelligence for this mission. According to Herodotus, the king assembled a group of men he trusted to report accurately, and among them was Scylax of Carianda. Scholars have long recognized that it was, at its core, a reconnaissance mission, a military survey designed to prepare the ground for Persian expansion into the Indus Valley. The party departed from a place Herodotus calls Caspotyrus, in a region he names Pactaica. Neither name has been definitively matched to a known location, which has caused millennia of scholarly debate. The most widely accepted theory holds that Caspotyrus was a garbled version of Pascopyrus, a Greek rendering of the name for what's now Peshawar in modern Pakistan. This would place the starting point somewhere in the valleys of the Kabul River, within the satrapy of Gandhara. Herodotus noted this was one of the least profitable tax districts of the entire Achaemenid Empire, precisely because it was poorly documented and surveyed. It was a remote and rugged frontier zone, and the kind of place where an ambitious king would naturally want better information, both to increase taxes and to launch further conquest. Here's where the story gets complicated. Herodotus says that Scylax and his crew sailed downstream in an easterly direction to the sea. The problem is that the Indus doesn't flow east, but rather southwest. This contradiction has led some commentators over the millennia to question whether the voyage happened at all. But modern scholars have largely put those doubts to rest, with the most compelling explanation being that Scylax didn't start on the Indus itself. He likely began on the Kabul River, which does flow in a generally easterly direction, and followed it for roughly 200 miles before merging with the Indus. This isn't just an educated guess trying to make the known geographic facts fit the ancient evidence. A fragment preserved by the writer Athenaeus describes Scylax writing about the Indus passing between towering cliffs covered in wild forest and thorny plants before turning. This is a description that fits the Indus River Gorge remarkably well. From that confluence, Scylax would have turned south, following the Indus on its long journey toward the Arabian Sea. The Indus is one of the great rivers of the world, stretching roughly 2,000 miles, and in the 6th century, the lands along it were largely unknown to the Persian and Greek worlds. When Scylax finally reached the delta of the Indus, he found that only one of its several mouths was actually navigable, with the others being too shallow and marshy to allow passage. This kind of practical detail is exactly what Darius would have needed for any form of planned invasion. The river journey was only the beginning. Once Scylax reached the open sea, he turned westward and began one of the most ambitious coastal voyages of the ancient world. His route took him along the shores of the Indian Ocean, hugging the coastline of what's now Pakistan and Iran. The conditions along this stretch, known in antiquity as Gedrosia, were brutal. We know this not from Scylax's own account, which has been lost, but from a later parallel voyage. Nearly 2 centuries afterward, Alexander the Great's admiral Nearchus sailed the same route and left a detailed account which was preserved through a Roman historian. He described ferocious tides, enormous whales, and harsh conditions along the Gedrosian shore, and it's fairly safe to assume that Scylax encountered similar challenges. Scylax likely made a significant stop at Harmozaya, modern Manab in Iran, one of the largest ports in the Persian Gulf region. Here, he may have repaired his ships and resupplied before pressing on. From Harmozaya, the route took him past Makkah, corresponding to modern Oman, and then around the entire Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian coast was dotted with small settlements and trading ports, and Scylax would have passed through waters controlled by communities who managed the coastal trade in incense. The southwestern tip of the peninsula, in what's now Yemen, was home to a port the Greeks later called Eudaimon, meaning prosperous, corresponding to modern Aden. From there, Scylax sailed north through the Red Sea until he reached the area around Suez. Notably, this is the same point from which an earlier Egyptian pharaoh had once dispatched Phoenician sailors to circumnavigate Africa. The entire voyage lasted 30 months, covering roughly 3,200 miles from the Indus Delta to the northern Red Sea alone. Scylax's mission delivered exactly what Darius wanted. Herodotus is quite clear about the sequence of events. Once the voyage was completed, Darius conquered the Indians and made use of the sea in those parts. Around 516 BC, the Indus Valley was incorporated into the Achaemenid Empire as a new province called Hindush. It became one of the wealthiest satrapies in the empire, a testament to the strategic value of the intelligence Scylax had gathered. Herodotus describes Hindush as lying to the west of the Thar Desert, which means the province essentially covered what we'd now call Sindh, the middle and lower Indus basin. The conquest opened up oceanic trade routes between India, Persia, and Egypt, formalizing and controlling the commercial geography of the ancient world. Darius also commissioned a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, commemorating it with inscriptions boasting that ships could now travel from Egypt to Persia by sea. It's impossible to separate this project from the knowledge Scylax brought back given the timelines. The explorer had demonstrated that a continuous sea route existed from the Indus to the Red Sea, and Darius was determined to exploit it fully. After completing his voyage, Scylax appears to have devoted himself to writing, and he produced a work traditionally called the Periplus, which he apparently dedicated to Darius. The book has been entirely lost, surviving only in a handful of quotations scattered across later authors, but those fragments tell us a great deal. The Periplus wasn't just a ship's logbook or a list of distances between ports, and it contained accounts of people, landscapes, natural conditions, and possibly political affairs. Scylax's influence on later writers is real, though often indirect and difficult to trace. Herodotus clearly knew of his voyage as he wrote of his journey. Aristotle also refers to him, and later geographers like Strabo preserve fragments of traditions associated with his work. Even as late as the Roman period, authors like Avienus were still drawing on geographic material that may ultimately go back to early explorers like Scylax. That said, the extent of his direct influence is uncertain. We don't have his original writings, and there's no clear evidence that even figures like Herodotus had access to a formal text written by him. And of course, if you know Herodotus, writing about Scylax's journey with extreme detail and total authority while having never read the text would be very on brand. Scylax seems to belong to a broader stream of early geographic knowledge circulating in the Greek world. Perhaps one of the most intriguing legacies of Scylax lies in language, and bear with me here for a moment. The Achaemenid Persians referred to the Indus region as Hindush. In Greek, this became Indos, reflecting the tendency of the Ionic dialect to drop initial aspirated sounds, and from there the Latin word India emerges. While it's impossible to tie this transformation to any single individual, the name India was ultimately likely filtered through this little-known ancient mariner. Interestingly, a later geographical work, now known as the Periplus of Pseudo-Scylax, was long attributed to him, and this attribution, though false, is very important. Written in the 4th century BC, it surveys the Mediterranean and surrounding coasts, but modern scholarship has shown it belongs to a much later intellectual context. This does speak to the influence Scylax had during the period, even though he's virtually unknown today. Someone wrote a work that was perceived to be of such quality that it must have come from Scylax, at least according to ancient people. The real Scylax, meanwhile, remains just out of reach, known only through fragments, references, and the enduring shadow of a journey that reshaped how the Greek world understood the East. What happened to Scylax after his voyage and his writing? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Some scholars have speculated that after reaching the Red Sea, he may have traveled overland to a Persian administrative center like Memphis to report his findings. That said, there's no direct evidence for this in any ancient sources, and it remains an educated guess. His writings are lost, but echoes of them survive in later authors, shaping early Greek ideas about lands to the east. Even the name India, derived from the Persian Hindush and the Greek Indos, reflects the kind of cultural exchange that journeys like his helped make possible. And yet, despite all of that, despite all he accomplished, despite his fame in the ancient world, today almost no one remembers him. Scylax of Karyanda remains a man whose traces are everywhere, but whose story survives only in brief fragments filtered through great ancient scholars. The air in the Roman Subura was often thick with the smell of flames and the stench of overcrowded tenements, a nuisance for most of the elite. But for Marcus Licinius Crassus, that smoke didn't signify tragedy so much as it represented a closing window of opportunity. It's easy to imagine him standing on a street corner, surrounded by 500 men, watching a multi-story apartment block engulfed in flames, while he calmly negotiated a price. He wouldn't lift a finger to help until the deed was signed, turning the public's worst nightmare into a private windfall. This was the foundation of a fortune so vast that it challenged the very stability of the Roman Republic. Crassus was a pioneer of a new kind of liquid diversified wealth that allowed him to underwrite the careers of legends like Julius Caesar. Ultimately, though, there was only one thing his mountains of gold and silver couldn't buy him: military glory. Rome was no longer a small Italian city-state in the 1st century BC. It had become a Mediterranean superpower, but its institutions were straining under the weight of its own success. The influx of wealth from conquests in Greece, Spain, and North Africa had created a massive disparity between the traditional landed aristocracy and the rising equestrian class. This period saw the transition from a tangible wealth based on land and loot to a more sophisticated liquid economy. Crassus stood at the center of this transformation. The economic sophistication of Rome during this era allowed for the growth of personal fortunes that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. For example, Scipio Africanus was considered the wealthiest man of his time, yet his fortune was largely composed of physical objects taken from Carthage and Spain. By contrast, the wealth of Crassus was roughly 40 times greater than that of Scipio. Most importantly, it existed on paper as much as it did in physical gold. It was a liquid fortune, capable of being invested and moved to capitalize on political and economic shifts. This liquidity gave Crassus a level of agility and influence that his ancestors couldn't have dreamed of. The origin of the wealth that would eventually define the late Republic didn't come from steady commerce or inherited land alone. Crassus came of age during one of the most violent periods in Roman history, the conflicts between the factions of Gaius Marius and Sulla. While he was born into a patrician family of some standing, they weren't among the mega-wealthy of their class, and Plutarch notes that he was raised in relatively modest circumstances. The chaos of the Marian-Sullan conflict provided a brutal springboard for his ambitions. When Sulla emerged victorious and declared himself dictator, he initiated the proscriptions, a legal mechanism for state-sponsored slayings and asset seizure. Sulla published lists of his enemies, and anyone on those lists could be eliminated without trial, their property confiscated and auctioned off by the state at artificially low prices. While some elite Romans saw the participation in these events as barbaric, Crassus was mastering them. He recognized that the political volatility of the time created a massive depression in property values. Because the estates of the proscribed were auctioned in a climate of fear, often with few bidders willing to risk Sulla's ire, Crassus was able to snap up massive tracts of land cheap. His ruthlessness was so pronounced that rumors circulated he had added the name of a man to the proscription list simply because he coveted the man's estate. This initial capital, built on the literal blood of the Roman aristocracy, gave Crassus the seed investment necessary to build a commercial empire. While many of his contemporaries were content to let their wealth sit in static agricultural estates, Crassus turned his attention to the urban heart of Rome. The city was a tinderbox of wooden apartment blocks, known as insulae, which were built so close together that a single spark could level an entire district. Recognizing a gap in public services, Crassus organized a private fire brigade of approximately 500 men who were trained not just as firefighters, but as architects and builders. This was a stroke of genius in vertical integration. The business model was as effective as it was predatory. When a fire broke out, Crassus and his brigade would rush to the scene. He'd offer to buy the burning building and the buildings in the path of the flames. If they didn't agree, the property owners would see their investments go to nothing, with no insurance to recover from. If they did agree, they could salvage a small amount of their wealth instead. For most landlords, the logical choice was clear. He would then rebuild and rent out to the same people at higher rates, creating a constant stream of income. Notably, Crassus was also rumored to be running fire brigades in the very literal sense of the word, though this allegation was never proven. Crassus understood that wealth in the ancient world was inextricably linked to the control of labor. His portfolio wasn't limited to urban real estate. It extended into silver mines, agriculture, and a massive, highly specialized labor force. Most of those working for him weren't there voluntarily, but surprisingly, unlike most Roman elites, he took the time to train and educate these bonded laborers. He owned thousands of individuals who served as scribes, silversmiths, architects, and more. His silver mines, particularly those in the Iberian Peninsula, were another cornerstone of his financial power. Silver was the lifeblood of the Roman economy, used for the coinage that paid the legions and facilitated trade across the Mediterranean. By controlling the production of the metal itself, Crassus ensured that his wealth was tied to the very foundations of the Roman monetary system. Trying to translate his immense wealth into modern dollars is a challenge that has fascinated historians and economists for centuries. The primary ancient sources, Plutarch and Pliny the Elder, provide figures that are staggering even by today's standards. The rough estimate is 200 million sesterces, which was the equivalent to the entire annual revenue of the Roman treasury during that era. Modern economic analyses have attempted to find more relatable comparisons. Some estimates, based on the bullion value of the silver he owned, place his net worth around $167 million to $240 million in 21st century prices. However, these figures often fail to account for the vastly different purchasing power of money in antiquity. Economists observe that he had the economic power to command tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of individuals. They've argued that this would likely make him a billionaire or even a trillionaire in modern-day terms. In the late Roman Republic, wealth wasn't just for luxury, it was a prerequisite for political survival and advancement. Crassus used his fortune as a mega-patron, building a network of influence that touched every level of Roman society. Many very influential Romans from ancient families were, relatively speaking, on the verge of constant financial catastrophe. He lent money to struggling senators and ambitious young politicians, often without interest, to secure their loyalty and votes in the Senate. His most famous investment was a young, debt-ridden gentleman named Julius Caesar. By paying off Caesar's massive debts and financing his early political campaigns, Crassus effectively bought a seat at the table of power. He used this to create a counterweight to his rival, the celebrated general and respected statesman, Pompey the Great. This relationship culminated in the formation of the First Triumvirate in 60 BC, an informal but dominant political alliance between Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey. It was a partnership of necessity. Caesar had the charisma and burgeoning popularity, Pompey had the prestige, and Crassus had the money. Through this coalition, the three men were able to bypass the traditional authority of the Senate, passing laws that benefited their private interests. Despite his unparalleled wealth and political influence, Crassus was haunted by a sense of inferiority. In the eyes of the Roman elite, true greatness was earned on the battlefield, not in the marketplace. Engaging in commerce outside of agriculture and mining was, in essence, viewed as below the station of the senatorial class. While he had successfully suppressed the revolt of Spartacus in 71 BC, much of the credit had been snatched away by Pompey, who arrived at the end of the conflict to claim glory. As Caesar began his spectacular conquest of Gaul, Crassus felt himself fading into the shadow of his two partners' military exploits. He was the man who paid the bills, but he wasn't the man whose name would be synonymous with Roman conquest. This desire to match the military reputation of Pompey and Caesar drove Crassus to seek the governorship of Syria in 54 BC. His goal wasn't just to manage a province, but to launch an unprovoked invasion of the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival in the east. He dreamed of reaching the banks of the Indus and surpassing the achievements of Alexander the Great. It's one of history's great ironies that the man who had built a fortune on meticulous calculation would throw everything away on a campaign motivated by pure, unhinged ego. The Parthian campaign was a disaster from the outset. Crassus ignored the advice of his local allies, who were highly familiar with the terrain and Parthian tactics. The Parthians recruited heavily from the steppes and were able to field powerful horse archers, a unit that was the scourge of the pre-modern world. King Artavasdes II of Armenia, a trusted Roman client king, suggested taking a northern route through the mountains where the Parthian cavalry would be less effective. Instead, Crassus chose to march his 7 legions, totaling some 43,000 men, directly into the blistering sandy plains of Mesopotamia. He was led by a guide named Ariamnes, who was secretly working for the Parthians and lured the Roman army away from the life-sustaining river routes into a tactical dead end. In 53 BC, near the town of Carrhae, the Romans were met by a Parthian force led by the brilliant general Serenus. Although the Romans significantly outnumbered the Parthians, they were unprepared for the enemy's tactics. Serenus utilized thousands of mounted archers who were able to maintain a constant barrage of armor-piercing arrows. They were supported by a baggage train of camels carrying a seemingly endless supply of ammunition and fresh horses. The Romans, forming a defensive square, were sitting ducks. When Crassus's son, Publius, led a desperate countercharge to break the circle, he and his men were annihilated. The Parthians returned to the main Roman line with the son's head on a spear, shattering what remained of the legionaries' morale. The end of Marcus Licinius Crassus was fittingly opulent. After a disastrous attempt to retreat, Crassus was pressured by his starving and mutinous troops to enter into negotiations. During the parley, a scuffle broke out. It's unclear if it was a deliberate trap or a spontaneous misunderstanding, and Crassus was slain in the fray. His head and right hand were cut off and sent to the Parthian king Orodes II as trophies of the victory. It's here that the legend of the molten gold takes root. According to the historian Cassius Dio, the Parthians, in a mocking tribute to Crassus's legendary avarice, poured molten gold down the throat of his corpse. Other versions claim that he was alive when this happened, though this appears to have been legends building upon themselves. While many modern historians view this as a symbolic fiction intended to provide a poetic end for a man defined by greed, it has become one of the most enduring stories in Roman history. Another account, provided by Plutarch, suggests a very literally theatrical end, with his head being used as a prop in a play at a Parthian banquet. The death of Crassus was a terminal blow to the stability of the Roman Republic. Crassus had served as the essential buffer between the competing ambitions of Pompey and Caesar. With him gone, the three-headed monster of the triumvirate was reduced to 2 rivals who no longer had a reason to cooperate. The conflict that followed between Caesar and Pompey eventually led to the collapse of republican institutions and eventually the rise of the Roman Empire. The scale of Crassus' wealth remains a benchmark for historical inequality, even if modern historians can't provide an accurate modern-day figure. He proved that in the late Republic, money could buy armies, influence, and political survival, but his end served as a grim reminder that even the greatest fortune has its limits. He died in the dust of a foreign land, having failed to secure the one thing he valued more than his millions, a legacy of military honor. Imagine a plant so valuable its resin was guarded like a gold mine and its image was minted on every coin. It wasn't a rare spice or a common grain, but a wild golden-flowered herb that refused to be tamed. This was silphium, the ancient world's most coveted botanical mystery, a wonder that allegedly cured everything from a simple cough to life-threatening illnesses. It was so precious that Julius Caesar once kept 1,500 pounds of it in the Roman treasury, yet by the time the 1st century AD drew to a close, it had vanished from the earth. The story of silphium is the first recorded instance of humans driving a species to extinction through greed and neglect. The legend began in 631 BC, when Greek settlers arrived in Cyrenaica, located in modern-day Libya. They found a narrow strip of land where silphium grew wild, thriving after a mysterious pitch-black rain had supposedly soaked the soil. For centuries, the citizens of Cyrene guarded their meadows as their most vital source of revenue. This botanical fluke turned Cyrene into an economic powerhouse. Because the plant only grew in a specific 125-mile-wide region and resisted all attempts at cultivation, the Greeks held a global monopoly. They managed the harvest like a high-stakes mining operation, setting strict quotas to ensure they didn't deplete the wild population. The plant's resin became a cornerstone of trade, sold for its weight in silver. Cyrene's kings, the Batiads, grew fabulously wealthy by exporting this sap across the Mediterranean. The plant was so central to their survival that it appeared on the front of their coins, often relegated to a position higher than the gods themselves. This has led some to believe that the plant was so revered by the populace that it was actually personified and then deified. For centuries, if you had silphium, you had the riches of the world, along with the power that came with that. In the kitchen, silphium was the ultimate luxury seasoning. Stalks were roasted or boiled like vegetables, while roots were dipped in vinegar, but the true prize was the milky resin. After being tapped from the plant, the sap was mixed with flour to prevent decay and shipped in small blocks. It had a complex sulfurous aroma that supposedly left a pleasant fragrance on the breath. Medicinally, it was regarded as a miracle panacea. Pliny the Elder recorded nearly 40 remedies, suggesting it could treat indigestion, epilepsy, and even snake bites. It was used as a topical salve for wounds, a cure for sore throats, and a way to remove warts. Hippocrates even recommended it for gut issues, while others thought it could cure baldness. The plant's most famous use, however, was in reproductive health. It was highly prized as a contraceptive. Women would take a pea-sized amount of the resin once a month to prevent conception or manage their cycles. This widespread use meant that silphium was deeply connected to the themes of love and intimacy, and many historians believe this is where our modern heart symbol originated. On silver coins from Cyrene, these heart-shaped seed pods are displayed prominently, providing a visual link between the plant's biological form and its cultural meaning. Even the poet Catullus referenced silphium-bearing Cyrene when writing about the infinite number of kisses he wanted to share with his lover. This poetic interlude highlights how the plant permeated the romantic imagination of the ancient elite. Despite its fame, silphium's exact botanical identity remains a mystery. Since it vanished before modern science could classify it, we're left with ancient descriptions and coin imagery. It's generally agreed that the plant belonged to the genus Ferula, making it a relative of giant fennel or celery. It had a thick, grooved stalk and umbrella-like yellow flower clusters. Some scientists have proposed species like Ferula tingitana or Thapsia gumifera, but these don't quite match the medicinal potency described by authors like Pliny. Recently, a Turkish scientist identified Ferula drudiana in Turkey as a possible candidate, noting its heart-shaped seeds and unique chemical compounds. This sparked a new wave of interest, because he found it growing near ancient Greek villages in Anatolia. This suggested it may have been brought there by settlers who hoped to save it from extinction. While this find is exciting, many remain skeptical because the plant is native to Anatolia rather than Libya. The tragedy of Silphium's extinction is a cautionary tale for our own age. When Rome took control of the region, the pressure for short-term profit began to erode the sustainable practices of the Greeks. Greedy tax farmers ignored harvest limits, while sheep farmers discovered that silphium-fed meat was a culinary sensation. Overgrazing became a massive problem, as sheep ate the young plants before they could produce seeds. This wasn't just about overconsumption, though. Massive deforestation for agriculture and timber changed the local microclimate, leading to rapid desertification. The plant was incredibly sensitive to soil conditions and likely required a specific cycle of cold temperatures to germinate. As the landscape dried and the forests vanished, the conditions for Silphium's survival disappeared. By the time of the Emperor Nero, only one stalk remained in Cyrenaica. It was harvested and sent to him as a curiosity, marking the quiet end of a species that had once bankrolled a kingdom. It's a sobering reminder that even the most precious resources aren't infinite. While we may never taste the resin that Caesar valued more than gold, the legacy of Silphium survives in every heart-shaped token of affection we share, even if we didn't know it. It's a silent tribute to a plant that was once the pulse of an entire world.